The frustrated cry of a nanny echoed through the 28th floor hallway of Sawyer Tower. "Girls, I'm done. I quit." Thomas Fisher, the silent janitor who had spent the last 3 years cleaning these pristine corridors, paused mid-step. His maintenance cart rolled to a gentle stop before the glass door, light reflecting off his worn name badge. Inside the luxury playroom, 2 identical girls sat pressed into the corner, arms wrapped around their knees, eyes hollow and vacant like they had learned to disappear to avoid being hurt again. 10 nannies in 3 months. The woman muttered into her phone as she stormed past him, heels clicking sharply against marble. Thomas watched her go, then turned back to the glass. Those eyes. He knew those eyes. He had seen them in the mirror 4 years ago, and in his son's face every night since the accident. He should have kept walking. He should have minded his business. Instead, he pushed his cart through the door and said quietly, "Hey, I'm Thomas. I clean here." Neither girl responded. But in that silence, something had already begun to shift. Thomas Fisher's small Brooklyn apartment smelled of wood shavings and black coffee every morning before dawn. He sat at the kitchen table, carving knife moving in slow, deliberate strokes across a block of pine. Shavings fell like snow onto newspaper spread beneath his hands. On the table sat a growing collection of small wooden figures. Fish, birds, stars, hearts, each one sanded smooth, each one a symbol of comfort he wished he could give his son. Dylan appeared in the doorway wearing dinosaur pajamas, hands moving in practiced sign language. Couldn't sleep. Thomas set down the knife and signed back. "I'm making gifts for 2 little girls." Dylan's eyes brightened. "Like the fish you made me?" His father nodded. "Exactly like that." The boy climbed into the chair beside him, picking up one of the wooden birds, turning it over in small hands. They sat together in companionable silence. Father and son, both knowing what it meant to live in a world that had gone quiet. 4 years had passed since the accident that took Claire's life and Dylan's hearing. 4 years since Thomas had walked away from his nursing career because he could no longer bear the sounds of hospital corridors, the beeping monitors, the overhead pages, the desperate voices of families losing people they loved. He had become a janitor because invisible work suited a man trying to disappear from his own grief. But grief, he had learned, never fully disappeared. It just changed shape, became something you carried differently. Dylan signed. "Will they like the gifts?" Thomas signed back. "I hope so. They look like they need something to hold on to." His son nodded solemnly, understanding in a way most 7-year-olds never should. Loss had made them both fluent in the language of broken things. Across the city, on the top floor of the building Thomas cleaned, Vanessa Sawyer stood before floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The sunrise painted the skyline in shades of gold and rose. But she barely noticed. On her desk lay an open report from the Children's Therapy Center. Patients continue to demonstrate severe withdrawal. No verbal communication, no positive engagement with caregivers or peers. Recommend continued observation. She removed her glasses and pressed her fingers against her temples. Her phone buzzed another message from the nanny agency. "Miss Sawyer, we regret to inform you that nanny number 10 has resigned effective immediately. We're having difficulty finding candidates willing to work with your daughters given the circumstances." Given the circumstances. As if her children were circumstances. As if trauma could be managed like a quarterly earnings report. Vanessa had built an empire from nothing. She had clawed her way from a studio apartment in Queens to the executive suite of one of New York's most successful real estate development firms. She had done it alone, pregnant and discarded by a man who decided fatherhood was inconvenient for his political ambitions. She had survived the whispers, the judgments, the board members who questioned whether a single mother could lead a corporation. But none of it had prepared her for this, for watching her daughters retreat so far inside themselves that she could no longer reach them. The incident had happened 18 months ago. A birthday party. A bounce house. 2 little girls who wandered too close to the generator. The electrical shock had lasted only seconds, but the psychological aftermath seemed endless. Skylar and Nova hadn't spoken since that day. They had simply stopped. Stopped talking. Stopped playing. Stopped being the bright, chattering children who used to fill her penthouse with laughter. Therapists used words like selective mutism and trauma response and give them time. But time felt like sand slipping through her fingers, and she was terrified of losing her daughters to a silence she couldn't break. Vanessa picked up a framed photograph from her desk. The twins at age 4, grinning gap, toothed smiles, arms around each other. She traced their faces with one finger. "I don't know how to help you," she whispered to the empty office. "I don't know what you need." In his apartment, Thomas finished carving the wooden fish, its scales rendered in delicate detail. He placed it beside the one he had made for Dylan years ago, a matching pair. Separated by time and circumstance, but identical in craftsmanship. He ran his thumb across the smooth surface, feeling the weight of a promise he had once failed to keep. A promise to protect. A promise to heal. Maybe, he thought, picking up the fish. Maybe it wasn't too late to try again. The next afternoon, Thomas returned to the 28th floor with a work order that read HVAC inspection playroom. It wasn't entirely fabricated. The ventilation system did need checking, but his real reason for being there had nothing to do with air filters. The playroom was silent when he entered. Skylar and Nova sat in the same corner, where he had seen them the day before, identical in their stillness. They wore matching lavender dresses, someone's attempt, he supposed, to maintain normalcy through routine. But their eyes remained distant, focused on nothing, seeing everything and nothing at once. Thomas said nothing. He had learned from Dylan that sometimes the greatest kindness was not filling silence with meaningless words. Instead, he set down his toolbox and reached into his pocket. The wooden fish fit perfectly in his palm. He walked to the center of the room and placed it gently on the carpet. Then stood and moved to the air conditioning unit. Opening his toolbox with quiet, deliberate movements. He worked for 20 minutes, checking filters, testing airflow, cleaning vents. He never looked directly at the girls. Never asked questions. Never made demands. When he finished, he closed his toolbox, picked up his clipboard, and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he glanced back. One small hand had moved. Just slightly. Fingers hovering an inch above the wooden fish. He didn't smile. Didn't acknowledge what he had seen. He simply left, closing the door softly behind him. The next day, he brought a bird. The day after, a star. Then a heart. Then a tiny moon. Each afternoon, he found an excuse to enter the playroom, checking smoke detectors, replacing light bulbs, inspecting window seals. Each time, he left another carved figure in the center of the floor. Each time, he worked in silence, his presence becoming as predictable and unthreatening as sunlight moving across the room. The building supervisor walked past once and peered through the glass door. "Fisher, you're in here a lot lately." Thomas didn't miss a beat. "Old building. Lots of maintenance issues on this floor." The supervisor nodded and moved on, clipboard in hand, never knowing that the real repair work had nothing to do with building systems. By the 5th day, something had shifted. When Thomas entered, both girls were sitting slightly closer to the center of the room. Their eyes, though still guarded, tracked his movements. He placed a butterfly on the carpet that day, the most intricate carving yet. Wings spread in mid-flight. As he worked, he felt their attention like warm sunlight on his back. When he left, their gazes followed him all the way to the door. That evening, he sat with Dylan at their kitchen table. His son signed, "Are they getting better?" Thomas considered the question. "They're watching now." "That's different from looking away." Dylan nodded, understanding the distinction. "That's how it started for me too. After Mom died, I watched you before I could trust you again." The words, even in sign language, carried weight. Thomas reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "And now?" Dylan smiled. "Now I know you're not going anywhere." "Never," Thomas signed. "I promise." On the 6th day, Thomas brought a wooden owl and stayed longer than usual. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting geometric shadows across the plush carpet. He set down his toolbox and, instead of immediately beginning work, sat down cross-legged on the floor. Not close to the girls, he maintained careful distance, but close enough that they could see him clearly. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Thomas raised his hands and began to sign. His movements were fluid, graceful, telling a story without words about a moon that watched over frightened children, keeping them safe through the darkest nights. He moved his hands like a dancer, like a painter, creating pictures in the air that transcended language. Skylar's eyes widened. Nova leaned forward slightly. Something flickered in their expressions, curiosity perhaps, or recognition. The story continued. The moon had a friend, a wise owl, who could see everything but judged nothing. The owl knew that silence was sometimes the bravest sound a person could make. When Thomas finished, he placed the wooden owl in the center of the circle, formed by the other carvings. Then he stood, returned to his work on a wall outlet, and pretended not to notice the way both girls stared at the space where his hands had been. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was helping or simply projecting his own need to fix broken things. But when he arrived the next morning and saw through the glass door that all 6 wooden figures had been arranged in a perfect circle, deliberate, intentional, careful, he knew. They had seen him. More than that, they were answering. He entered the room and placed a 7th figure in the center of the circle. Another owl, smaller than the first. He knelt and signed slowly, clearly. Wise. Sees everything. Judges nothing. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Skylar's hands moved, trembling, uncertain, forming shapes that Thomas recognized immediately. Thank you. His throat tightened. He signed back. You're welcome. What's your name? Her hands spelled it out. Skylar. He repeated the sign, making it smooth, natural. Then he looked at her sister, eyebrows raised in gentle question. Nova's hands were shakier but determined. Nova. Beautiful names, he signed. Then, because it felt right, he introduced himself properly. I'm Thomas. This is my language. My son Dylan is deaf. We talk like this at home. Understanding bloomed across both small faces. They weren't broken. They had simply found a different way to speak. Skylar signed. People get angry when we don't talk. Thomas shook his head firmly. Not here. Here. Silence is okay. Here. You choose. Something released in the room, a tension that had been wound tight for months, unwinding by slow degrees. Nova reached for the small owl and held it against her chest. Skylar touched the butterfly's wings, and Thomas, the janitor who cleaned floors and fixed broken things, felt his own heart begin to heal in the presence of 2 little girls who had finally been given permission to be exactly who they needed to be. Vanessa Sawyer left her board meeting early, exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders like physical weight. She had fired the head of the childcare center that morning, one more person who promised miracles and delivered only failure. She rode the elevator to the 28th floor, preparing herself for the familiar scene. Her daughters sitting silent and separate. Another nanny on the verge of quitting. Another day of helplessness. The elevator doors opened. She walked down the hallway, heels muted on thick carpet. As she approached the playroom, she heard something that stopped her mid-step. Laughter. Silent laughter. The kind that shakes shoulders and crinkles eyes even without sound. She rushed to the glass door and froze, hand pressed against the frame. Inside, her daughters sat in a circle with a man in a maintenance uniform and a young boy. Their hands were moving, signing, rapid and animated. Skylar was giggling, her whole body expressing joy. Nova had crawled closer to the boy, showing him something she had built from blocks. The man was smiling, his weathered face transformed by warmth. This was the janitor, the man she passed in hallways and never really saw. The man her assistants probably complained about to building management if he took too long in executive spaces. And he was sitting on the floor of her daughter's playroom, speaking to them in a language she barely understood. And they were. They were present. Fully, completely present, in a way she hadn't seen in 18 months. Vanessa's hand trembled as she pushed open the door. All four people looked up. The man Thomas, she remembered from his badge, stood quickly, professionally. "I'm sorry, Miss Sawyer. I was just... How did you do this?" Her voice broke. She couldn't help it. Couldn't maintain the CEO composure when her daughters were looking at her with clear eyes for the first time in over a year. Thomas glanced at the children, then back at her. "I didn't make them talk, ma'am. My son Dylan is deaf. We use sign language at home. Maybe it felt safe for them. A way to communicate without failing." Vanessa finished, understanding flooding through her. Without disappointing people who kept expecting words. He nodded. Skylar's hands moved, signing something Vanessa almost caught. Thomas translated. "She says I'm kind. That I give them things to hold. When they're scared." Vanessa's vision blurred with tears. She had bought her daughters every toy imaginable, hired the best therapists, created the most beautiful spaces, but she had missed the simplest truth. They didn't need more. They needed less. Less pressure, less expectation, less noise. Vanessa knelt down and signed clumsily, imperfectly, using the basic ASL she had been secretly studying for months through online courses late at night. "I'm so glad you found your voices." Both girls went absolutely still. Then, moving as one the way they had when they were toddlers, they ran to her. Not to Thomas, not to his son, to her. They crashed into her arms and held on like they were drowning, and she was solid ground. Vanessa wrapped them tight, pressing her face into their hair, breathing in the scent of children's shampoo and something indefinably precious. "I've got you," she whispered, voice muffled. "I've got you both. I'm so sorry it took me so long to understand." When she finally looked up, Thomas was gathering his toolbox, preparing to give them privacy. "Wait," she said. "Please. Don't go." He paused. She stood, keeping one hand on each daughter's shoulder. "I don't know how to repay you for this. Name your price. I'll double your salary, triple it, I'll hire you, as their full-time caregiver, Miss Sawyer." His voice was gentle but firm. "I don't want money for this. I did it because everyone deserves to be seen. Really seen. Your daughters needed someone who understood that silence isn't emptiness." Dylan signed something to his father. Thomas smiled and translated. "He says your girls are really good at building towers. Better than him." Vanessa laughed, the sound watery and relieved. "Will you come back? Not as their employee, as their..." She struggled for the word. "As their friend?" Thomas looked at his son, who nodded eagerly. Then back at the twins, who were signing. "Please. Please come back. We'll come back." Thomas agreed. "If that's truly what you want." Skylar and Nova's answer was to run to Dylan and hug him. All three children tangled together in uncomplicated acceptance. Vanessa watched them, then looked at Thomas. Really looked at him. Not the janitor. Not the employee. The person. The father. The man who had given her back something she thought was lost forever. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing what I couldn't." He met her eyes. "You would have found your way. You just needed someone to show you there were other paths to walk." And in that moment, in a playroom filled with wooden carvings and scattered toys, two separate worlds began to understand they might not be so separate after all. The next evening, Vanessa asked Thomas if he would return officially this time, during reasonable hours, not hidden behind maintenance requests. She offered to compensate him fairly. He refused payment, but agreed to come. "Everyone deserves to be seen," he had said. She was beginning to understand what he meant. So, began a new routine. Every evening after Thomas finished his shift, he would return to the 28th floor. Dylan always came with him, backpack slung over his shoulders, ready to teach Skylar and Nova new signs, new games, new ways to communicate without words. Vanessa learned to sit quietly in the corner, watching instead of directing. She was accustomed to being in control, to managing outcomes, to fixing problems with efficiency and decisiveness. But healing, she was discovering required something different. It required patience, surrender, trust. She watched Thomas interact with her daughters and saw something she had forgotten. Gentleness could be strength. He never raised his voice, never showed frustration when they retreated into themselves, never demanded more than they could give. He simply showed up, consistently, patiently, carved them small gifts, and made space for them to be exactly who they were. The children played quiet games. Dylan taught them shadow puppets. Thomas showed them how to feel music through vibrations by placing their hands on a speaker while instrumental tracks played. Skylar and Nova began to smile more, to initiate interactions instead of only responding, to exist in the world again instead of hiding from it. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep on the playroom carpet, curled together like puppies in a pile of cushions, Vanessa found herself sitting beside Thomas on the sofa. The penthouse was quiet, peaceful. She looked at him, really looked, and saw exhaustion around his eyes, calluses on his hands, silver threading through dark hair at his temples. Evidence of a life lived in service and sacrifice. "You've given me my daughters back," she said softly. He shook his head. "They were never gone, Miss Sawyer. Just waiting for someone patient enough to let them come back on their own terms." "Vanessa," she corrected. "Please, call me Vanessa." He smiled. "Vanessa." They sat in comfortable silence, watching 3 children sleep. Outside the windows, the city glittered like a field of fallen stars, and for the first time in 18 months, Vanessa felt something that had been absent from her immaculate, successful, carefully constructed life. Hope. 2 weeks later, after the children were settled with a movie in the media room, Vanessa poured 2 cups of tea and invited Thomas to sit with her in the smaller study, a room lined with books she never had time to read. The city lights cast long shadows across the hardwood floor. Rain tapped gently against the windows. "What happened to you?" she asked, not as a CEO gathering information, but as one human being trying to understand another. Thomas cupped the tea in both hands, staring into it as if reading the leaves. 4 years ago, he began quietly. "My wife Claire and I had an argument. Nothing catastrophic, just the usual married friction about schedules and whose turn it was to handle school pickup. She left angry. I let her." He paused, jaw tight. There was black ice on the bridge. Her car went through the guardrail. She died before the paramedics arrived. Vanessa's hand moved instinctively toward his, then stopped, unsure if touch would be welcome. "Dylan was in the car with her," Thomas continued. "He survived with a traumatic brain injury that took his hearing. The doctors said we were lucky, that it could have been so much worse." His voice went hollow. "I was a nurse. I knew how to save people, but I couldn't save my own family." "That's not." Thomas shook his head, cutting her off gently. "I know. Intellectually, I know it wasn't my fault, but knowing and believing are different things. I couldn't go back to the hospital after that. Couldn't hear the monitors, the codes, the families crying in waiting rooms. So I became a janitor, invisible work for a man who wanted to disappear." Vanessa understood that impulse more than she wanted to admit. "The twins' father left when I was 3 months pregnant," she said. "He was a congressman, married, told me a child would be politically inconvenient." She laughed bitterly. "He offered to pay for an abortion. When I refused, he offered money to disappear. I took the money, built my company, and raised my daughters alone." Thomas looked at her then, really looked, and she saw recognition in his eyes. "People think being strong means never breaking," he said. "But sometimes, strength is just continuing to exist after everything falls apart." "Yes." The word came out as a whisper. They sat in silence, 2 people carrying different griefs, finding unexpected understanding in the sharing of wounds. Finally, Thomas set down his tea. "You can't move on from love," he said. "You just learn to carry it differently. Dylan is my proof that life continues. That joy still exists even after devastating loss." Vanessa felt tears slip down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. "You're a good man, Thomas Fisher." He smiled. sad but genuine. You're a good mother, Vanessa Sawyer. Your daughters are lucky to have someone who loves them enough to keep trying when trying feels impossible. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted, a recognition that they were no longer just a grieving father and an overwhelmed mother helping each other's children. They were two people who had survived impossible things and were, somehow, still capable of connection. Vanessa reached across the space between them and took his hand. Thomas didn't pull away. The kiss, when it came, was soft, tentative, not driven by passion, but by something deeper. Gratitude, understanding, the simple human need to feel less alone. When they separated, Vanessa rested her forehead against his. "We should take this slowly," she whispered. "For the children." "Slowly," he agreed. Then, with a slight smile, "Coffee then? Tomorrow?" Coffee sounds perfect. The coffee dates became a routine, stolen hours in quiet cafes where Vanessa could shed her CEO armor, and Thomas could be something more than invisible. They talked about Dylan's progress in school, about Skylar and Nova's therapy appointments, about small victories and persistent fears. But they also talked about other things: books, music, the ways they had each rebuilt their lives from wreckage. Vanessa told him about clawing her way through business school while pregnant, about board members who underestimated her, about the satisfaction of proving them wrong. Thomas told her about learning sign language in hospital hallways, about the first time Dylan laughed after the accident, about finding peace in the simple act of making something beautiful with his hands. They discovered shared wounds but also shared hopes. Both had thought their capacity for joy had been permanently damaged. Both were learning they had been wrong. The children, sensing the shift between their parents, began to weave together into something resembling a family. Vanessa organized art sessions in the penthouse, spreading newspaper across expensive floors and letting the kids create without rules or expectations. Dylan painted swirling circles meant to represent sounds he imagined. Skylar painted wings, always wings. Nova painted towers that leaned but never quite fell. Thomas and Vanessa worked side by side, handing out brushes, mixing colors, laughing when paint ended up on faces instead of paper. Their hands brushed, their shoulders touched, small intimacies that felt enormous. Weekend picnics in Central Park became tradition. Thomas would pack sandwiches while Vanessa brought blankets and books. The children would run ahead, Dylan teaching the twins how to identify birds by the patterns of their flight, since he couldn't hear their songs. Vanessa and Thomas would walk slowly behind, hands linked, watching their children exist in uncomplicated friendship. "Is this real?" Vanessa asked one afternoon, lying on the blanket beside Thomas, while the kids climbed a nearby tree. "It feels too good to be real." "It's real," he said, turning to look at her. "Maybe that's what makes it scary." She knew what he meant. They had both learned that good things could be taken away, that happiness was not guaranteed, that loving someone meant risking devastation. One evening, standing on her penthouse balcony with the city spread out below like a promise, Vanessa asked, "Is it wrong to be happy again?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "No. Love after loss isn't wrong. It means we survived. It means we're still capable of hope." She leaned against him, feeling his warmth, his solidity. "I thought I was done with this. With trusting someone. With letting anyone matter this much." "Me too," he admitted. "But then I met two little girls who needed patience, and their mother who needed the same thing." Vanessa tilted her face up to kiss him deeper this time, more certain. And there, 50 floors above the city, surrounded by light and possibility, they began to believe that broken things could be made beautiful again. Not fixed, not the same as before, but beautiful in new and unexpected ways. Winter arrived early that year, painting the city in shades of silver and white. The five of them, Thomas, Dylan, Vanessa, Skylar, and Nova, had fallen into easy rhythms. Dinners together several nights a week, weekend adventures to museums and parks, bedtime stories told in sign language and whispered words. The girls were speaking more now, short sentences, quiet observations, but they still preferred signing when overwhelmed. Vanessa had become fluent, her hands moving with increasing confidence. One Saturday morning, they all bundled into warm coats and took the subway to a community garden in Brooklyn, the same one where Thomas had brought Dylan after Claire died, seeking something living to tend when everything felt dead. The garden was dormant but beautiful. Skeletal trees reaching toward pale sky. The children scattered immediately, Dylan showing the twins how to identify winter birds' nests in bare branches. Thomas unpacked a thermos of hot chocolate, while Vanessa spread a blanket on a bench. They sat close, shoulders touching, watching the children explore. Nova knelt beside a stone wall, carefully stacking flat rocks into a precarious tower. Skylar sat nearby, signing a running commentary about the birds Dylan was pointing out. Everything was normal, peaceful, and then Nova spoke. Not a whisper. Not a single word. A full sentence. Clear and purposeful. The tower needs one more stone. Everyone froze. Thomas's hand stilled on the thermos lid. Vanessa's breath caught audibly. Dylan, seeing his father's expression, looked around in confusion, then understanding. Skylar turned to her sister, eyes wide. The moment stretched, fragile as spun glass. Then Skylar spoke too, voice rough from disuse but steady. I miss talking too sometimes, but signing feels safer. Nova looked up at them all, blinking in the winter sunlight. Did I do something wrong? Vanessa was across the garden in seconds, dropping to her knees, pulling both daughters into her arms. No, baby. No, you did something wonderful. You both did. She was crying open, unashamed tears. You can talk whenever you want. Or never. Or only sometimes. We love you exactly as you are. Skylar's small arms tightened around her mother's neck. We know. That's why it feels safe now. Thomas stood, Dylan beside him, signing rapid questions. His father translated. Dylan wants to know if they'll keep signing too. Nova nodded seriously. Signing is how Thomas talks to us. How we all talk. We don't want to stop. Then we won't, Vanessa said, pulling back to look at her daughters. We'll do both. Whatever feels right. The five of them sat together on the cold ground, holding each other while winter birds called overhead, and the city hummed its endless song around them. It wasn't a miracle. It was simply children who had been given time, patience, and unconditional acceptance finally feeling safe enough to emerge from their protective silence. That evening, back in the warmth of Vanessa's penthouse, the twins taught Dylan a new sign they had invented together, a combination of family and chosen. They used it to describe the five of them, not bound by blood or law, but by something stronger. Love that had grown slowly in the spaces between words. Spring arrived with a riot of color, painting the city in dogwood blossoms and fresh green leaves. Thomas stood in his workshop, a corner of the apartment he had transformed into a space for his woodworking, putting finishing touches on his most ambitious carving yet. 5 figures, each distinct but connected, hands linked in an unbreakable circle. He had worked on it for 3 months, carving late into the night after Dylan went to bed. Each figure had been rendered with meticulous care. A tall man, a woman with her hair pulled back, 3 children of varying heights. No faces, just suggestion. The way memory softens details but preserves essence. The piece was small enough to hold in 2 hands but weighed almost nothing. Wood had a way of being both substantial and light, like hope. Thomas set down his tools and examined the carving in lamplight. It was ready. He wrapped it carefully in cloth and placed it in his backpack. The next morning, he called Vanessa. Can you meet me at the community garden today? Bring the kids? She heard something in his voice, nervousness, anticipation, and agreed immediately. They arrived to find Thomas and Dylan already there, standing near the stone wall where Nova had built her tower months ago. Skylar and Nova ran ahead, signing greetings. Dylan signed back. Then all 3 children exchanged a look, conspiratorial, excited. Vanessa approached more slowly, sensing this was something significant. Thomas looked at her, then at the children. He nodded. Dylan, Skylar, and Nova each pulled out a piece of poster board from behind the bench. Together, they held them up. Crude letters, painted in bright colors. "Will you marry us?" Vanessa's hands flew to her mouth. Thomas knelt on the cold ground, producing the cloth-wrapped carving. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing the 5 connected figures. "All of us," he said quietly. "We want to be a real family. Not just people who love each other, but officially, legally, permanently family." Tears streamed down Vanessa's face. She looked at her daughters, at Dylan, at Thomas kneeling before her with a piece of art instead of a ring. "All of you?" she whispered. The children nodded in unison. Skylar signed. "We voted. It was unanimous. 3 against 2, Nova added solemnly. "We outnumbered you." Vanessa laughed through her tears, the sound bright and clear. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of you. Yes to this beautiful, strange, perfect family." The children erupted into cheers, running to embrace both adults in a tangle of arms and joy. Thomas stood, still holding the carving, and kissed Vanessa while their children clung to them both. "For you," he said, when they finally separated, pressing the wooden figures into her hands. "For us, something to hold on to when things get hard." She held it against her chest, feeling its smooth surface, its careful craftsmanship. "It's perfect. You're all perfect." They stood together in the garden, 5 people who had each been broken in different ways but had somehow found each other and formed something whole. Around them, spring sang its song of renewal, and for once, the future felt less like a threat and more like a promise. The wedding took place 6 months later in the same Brooklyn garden, where everything had truly begun. They kept it small, just close friends. Dylan's grandparents, a few of Vanessa's colleagues who had become more than professional acquaintances. The trees were ablaze with autumn color, gold and crimson leaves drifting down like blessings. Skylar and Nova wore matching dresses in deep burgundy, flower crowns woven through their dark hair. Dylan stood beside his father in a suit that made him look startlingly grown-up, signing the vows as Thomas spoke them aloud. "I promise to be patient when patience is hard. To listen when listening means sitting in silence. To love not despite our scars, but because of them, because they prove we've survived. And we're still here, still trying, still believing that tomorrow can be better than yesterday." Vanessa's voice shook as she spoke her own vows. "I thought I knew what strength looked like. I thought it was building empires and never showing weakness. But you taught me that real strength is vulnerability, that asking for help isn't failure, that love isn't something we achieve, it's something we practice every single day." She looked at the 3 children standing beside them. "I choose this family, not because it's easy, but because it's real, because you've all taught me that the best things in life are the ones we build together from broken pieces." When the officiant pronounced them married, the children rushed forward before the kiss, piling into a group embrace that knocked Thomas slightly off balance. Laughter rippled through the small gathering. The kiss, when it finally happened, was witnessed by 3 grinning children and a sunset that painted the sky in impossible shades of pink and gold. The reception was held in Vanessa's penthouse, transformed with simple decorations and abundant food. There were no speeches, no formal toasts, just people talking and laughing, music playing softly, children running through rooms that had once been too quiet. Late in the evening, after most guests had left, the 5 of them gathered around the piano in the corner of the living room. Vanessa had been taking lessons, wanting to learn an instrument she could share with Dylan even though he couldn't hear it in traditional ways. Skylar and Nova stood beside her, their voices blending in a simple song they had written together, something about finding home after being lost. Dylan sat at the piano bench, hands pressed lightly against the wood, feeling the vibrations of music travel through his fingers. His eyes were closed, a slight smile on his face. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching his family because that's what they were now. Officially and irrevocably, his family, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 4 years. Complete peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something strong enough to hold the pain without being consumed by it. When the song ended, the children clustered together on the couch, already drowsy. Vanessa came to stand beside Thomas at the window, his arm settling naturally around her shoulders. The city spread out below them, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one carrying its own story of loss and survival and hope. "We built something beautiful from broken pieces," she said softly. "We did," he agreed. On the mantel above the fireplace, the carved wooden family sat beside the very first gift Thomas had ever left for the twins, a small fish, smooth and perfect, symbols of a journey that had started with silence and ended with song. Skylar stirred on the couch, sighing sleepily. "Are we really a family now?" Nova, already half asleep against her sister, murmured. "We've been family for a while. Now we just have paperwork." Dylan signed from where he was curled against the armrest. "The best kind of family. The kind we chose." Thomas smiled, squeezing Vanessa closer. She turned her face up to his, and they kissed again, softer this time, more private, a promise renewed. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, but here, in this space they had created together, there was stillness, safety, the kind of love that doesn't erase scars, but holds them gently and says, "You are enough, exactly as you are, and you always will be." Sometimes healing doesn't come from words or therapy or time alone. Sometimes it comes from someone who sits beside your silence and stays. Who gives you permission to be broken, while showing you that broken things can still be beautiful. Who understands that family isn't about perfection, it's about showing up, every day, and choosing each other again and again and again. And in a penthouse high above New York City, 5 people who had each known devastating loss fell asleep knowing they had found something rare and precious, a place where they could be completely themselves, completely safe, completely loved. A family built not on obligation or blood, but on patience, understanding, and the quiet courage to trust again. The wooden figures on the mantel cast long shadows in the dimming light, 5 shapes linked together, holding on.